Hi, and welcome to the lecture on voice. This is a lecture that is being recorded at UWA. And just to start off with, I thought I'd give a little bit of information about who I am. So I am Josephine Wang. I work at UWA on the Big Picture project with Claire Jones, and I'm also the Professional Development Officer for the English Teachers Association of Western Australia. So this lecture is going to be about voice, how it works within the context of the WA syllabus, but also how it works further than that. So how it works within literature, but also how it works within film, which I know can be a little bit controversial based on the SCASA glossary on what voice means. So I'm going to try and take your understanding of what voice is further than hopefully what you currently know, and then hopefully it will give you an idea of what you can use in the classroom, text that you can use, but also how you can possibly teach this. So before we get started, I definitely want to make sure that you don't think I'm some sort of expert on this. What I'm presenting today is definitely what I've found through research. I've been researching voice for a few months now. If you attended my presentation at the state conference in 2020, then perhaps you already know a little bit about voice and where I'm coming from. And if you didn't, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to go through all of that again. There are loads of different ways that you can approach voice. These are just some of the ways that you can approach it. I am not saying that this list is exhaustive. There are numerous ways that you can do it, and I'll go into a little bit of that throughout this presentation. I am very aware of the syllabus glossary definition of voice, and this is definitely going to go sort of around that. It's going to go behind it in terms of where did that come from, and it's also going to go beyond that. And I hope that what you would take away from this lecture is some new and different ways to approach teaching this concept, because it is actually incredibly engaging and it's very interesting to look at, and I think that students will really enjoy it if we can take it a little bit further than what the glossary currently says. Obviously, the last comment, if you have anything that you would like to say about this, please get in contact with me. You can certainly do that via the ETA Facebook page, or you can do it via the ETA website. And please do, I'd love to hear what you have to say about voice as well. So I'd like you just to think about what is the difference between perspective, point of view, tone, voice, and style. These are sort of often the concepts that we consider intermingled, or perhaps we try and teach them individually. But I'd like you to actually just pause the presentation for the time being and think about what you consider the difference between these. So I'll give you a moment to pause, and then when you're ready, you can start again. Okay, so you've thought about what the difference is between these. This is how I believe that they are connected, and I'm not saying that this is absolute definitive. This is just how I like to consider it. So when I think about voice, I definitely think about perspective, point of view, tone, and style. And I think that often we forget style in this conversation that we have. Now, I'm going to get you to pause the presentation one more time, and I want you to think about where genre, language, and context fit in with your understanding of these. So pause it, write it down or think about it, and then come back. Okay, so this is where I believe that it sort of sits. So I believe that genre actually crosses over all of this, and I think that often we forget about how genre impacts voice, and this is something that I will talk about more later on. I also believe that obviously language is going to impact the way that we perceive voice and the way that we react to it, because that is the way that it is given to us. And context, obviously context impacts everything. So I don't think that we can look at these as separate concepts. I think that we have to think about them as interchangeable, or perhaps not interchangeable, but definitely overlapping. And I believe that they influence each other greatly. So this is how I used to teach voice. And this was particular to writing. So if you were looking at a piece of fiction or non-fiction, this is how I would teach it. So I'd say to my students, what is the tone of the piece? What is the point of view? Who is narrating? And then if you're looking at different voices that are being represented, I would say who is represented within this text. And this is the sort of response that I would get. The critical voice of the first-person narration makes the reader trust the narrator and positions the reader to also be critical of the situation. And I'm sure that if you've been teaching the ATAR course for a little while, this sort of response sounds very familiar to you. However, when we actually look at it, what is it really saying? It's not giving us a whole lot of critical thinking. It's almost like it's putting pieces into an equation and then saying this is the result. So what I want to try and do today is I want to try and give you some tools to get students to think about it in a different way and get them to feel like they have authority to talk about this with thought and with a critical lens. So these are the different types of voice as are is useful for our course. So when we are looking at the WA syllabus, we are certainly looking at narrative voice, and we look at that in visual and written texts. We look for authorial voice, whether we name it or not. This is part of what we do, and we certainly can look for that in written and visual texts as well. And then we look for voice in film. There are also voices, so representations of people and how they are represented. However, I'm not going to talk about that because I don't think that that is what is requiring support at the time for the time being. However, if that is something that you do struggle with, please just let me know and I will be happy to talk to you about it. So narrative voice is our bread and butter. It basically is what we should teach the students as their understanding of voice. If you don't want to take it any further, then narrative voice is a great place to start and a great place to end. I think there's much more to it than just narrative voice, but that doesn't mean that that is appropriate to you or your students. So the definitions from SCASA is not something that I'm going to touch on a lot. It does basically say that it's the personality of the piece of writing, and then it gives you some ideas of how you could look for it, whether it's syntax, punctuation, vocab, persona, and dialogue. I've also included the glossary definition for tone because that just says that it's the way the voice is delivered. However, I do believe that these are quite problematic, and I think that they are quite problematic because it says that voice, in a literary sense, is the personality of a piece of writing. However, that in some ways excludes film, and we know that that's not true because there are certainly voice in film. There are people who have PhDs about voice in film, so there is much more to voice than just the personality of a piece of writing. The definition at the very bottom for voice is from the literature glossary, and that says that it is the nature of the voice projected. So, for example, authorial voice, and I think that having put those in quotation marks suggests that this is too big a concept for them to unpack, and perhaps it is either expected that you already know what that means, or perhaps this is something that you will gloss over and your students won't take away a lot of it. However, I do think that it's important to point out that in the literature sort of supplementary information, it does say that students will be experimenting with elements of style and voice to achieve specific effects. And I particularly like that they've included this idea of style and voice because style and voice are very much linked. I do just want to point out that tone is not voice. So tone might be part of narrative voice, but it is not voice. It's not enough just to say that the voice is critical because there's much more to it than just that. So I don't want to touch on this anymore, and I also am not going to talk about the markers reports, so the examination reports, or the marking keys for the exam because that's a whole other lecture, and that's not what I'm here to do. So let's talk about narrative voice. So this is basically what it is. It's constructed by the author, and it's done through genre, style, structure, point of view, and language. So again, we've got genre and language sort of overarching in the way that we look at voice. And I'll give you a really nifty sort of framework to look at voice in a minute. And the narrator is telling the story, and it's not necessarily a character, especially if the text is written in third person. So even if it's written in first person, the narrator is generally separate from the character, because the narrator knows a lot more, might have different insights, even if it is from a first person. But if you're looking at third person, then certainly you can say that there is very clearly a narrator. And when you are teaching this to students, that's a good way in with them to say that when we're looking at third person, obviously you're not going to tell a story in the third person, so there's someone else that's telling that story. And the narrator can be reliable or unreliable. And it's actually quite easy to identify if you know what you're looking for. So when you are looking at a narrative voice, you are analysing the narrator of the text. And Wayne Booth, who in 1961 wrote this great big text, it's a whopper of a book if you ever get it out, called The Rhetoric of Narrative. And in that, he basically says that the narrator is there to tell the story, and the author is using this narrative voice to tell the story, and it is doing that by creating a reliable or unreliable narrator, and it's creating a certain distance between the reader and the characters and the narrator. And it's also certainly telling that story from a particular perspective, and this is when you can bring in lots of stuff about context, and you can talk about how the context of the author is going to influence the way that the story is written, but also perhaps the context of the narrator if that is evident in the story. So the student's job is to identify the reliability of the narrator, the perspective the story is told from, and then make some decisions about what the implications are when it's told from this perspective, and then have a think about the distance that's being created. And distance can be quite difficult for students to understand, but basically you're talking about how close are you going to be to the narrator, and how close is the author letting you be to the characters as well. And then once they've looked for this, they say, excuse me, they will basically say, these are the questions that I need to ask myself. So who is telling the story? Is it a character? Is it in first person? Or is it a narrator? And is this narrator very obvious? So for example, if you're looking for a first person, there's obviously a small distance between the reader and the narrator because they are allowing you more insight. And third person omniscient certainly will provide greater distance between the reader and the narrator. And then you also have third person limited, and that's going to be just some distance between the reader and the narrator. And the author will have decided on this prior to perhaps writing the novel. Then they need to ask themselves, is the narrator reliable or unreliable? And how do I know that? And what language, so what words are being used to shape this narrative voice? And then, and this is the important thing, is that it's the student's job to comment on how effective this is, because the narrator is being constructed by the author, and that narrator is either telling you about the characters, but it's a two-way relationship when you are reading a novel, because the author has written the novel, and then the reader is deciding on the effect of this. So how effective was this for me? How effective did I think that this distance was? Or how effective did I think that this character was, or the narrator, or this voice? So it's really interesting when you ask students to comment on something that they are allowed to have an opinion on. So that also means that you are opening the students up to have different readings of a text, and that's when we can start getting some really good answers from our students. So this is a nice way to give students a bit of authority to actually comment on what they believe the effect is of that voice. So this is basically a way to get students to talk. So you know that there is an author. The author has created this narrator and the narrative voice, and the narrator is telling you about these characters. So if you tell this to students, ask them to think about the voice as a construction and ask them to think about the effect of this construction on them. So did they believe in this narrator? Did they engage with this narrator? So we know that students, particularly in the 2021 exam, there was a really high response rate to the personal context question, where the majority of students actually answered that question. And we know that students feel that when we give them authority to talk from their own perspective, then they're more likely to engage with what it is that we're saying. So when it comes to voice, this is exactly the same. Look for the effect of the voice on your students. Have them say, this was really effective because, and then they will start deconstructing the text. So I've sort of already touched on this a little bit. There are certainly concepts that overlap with voice. In all texts, whether it's written or visual, perspective, context, point of view, genre, content, structure, language, representation, and style are all going to overlap with voice. They are part of the construction of the voice. Whether you are going to look at all of those in an essay, probably not, but it is important for you to tell the students that these are all parts of voice and these are all things that have shaped the voice that you are currently engaging with. And then there are certainly some that are specific to visual text, and that will be the directorial style, the camera angles and distance, shot type, and cultural iconography. So some of these things you might not have thought about in terms of voice, but they very much impact the voice of a visual text, and that's because that's part of the construction of a visual text. So therefore it's part of the construction of the voice of that text. So let's have a quick look at narrative voice in The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. The texts that I have chosen here are copyright free. So the reason that I've chosen Edgar Allan Poe is because you can access it, and most teachers at least are aware of Edgar Allan Poe, and there are some great ways that you can go into Edgar Allan Poe with your students, whether it's through The Simpsons or parody or looking at context, looking at genre. Any of those things I think will be really useful. So I am going to read this and you can certainly read along as we go. So The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This is the very last paragraph. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But, ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. I continued and became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God! What could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards. But the noise arose all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God! No, no! They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark! Louder, 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 louder! Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here is the beating of his hideous heart. So when we are looking at voice, what we look for firstly is certainly the perspective and the point of view from which it is being told. So we know that this is told from first person point of view, and we know that because it says my manner, I fancied a ringing in my ears. So obviously we know that it's first person. We also know that the perspective, or at least in this part of it, the narrator is unnamed. So we can't name the narrator, but we know that it's first person. A few other things that I looked for were easy language features. So I'm not one of those English teachers who know all the language features off by heart. I have sort of an arsenal of about 5 or 6 that I know, and that really has gotten me through so far. So I just tell my students, look for easy language features, especially if language features is something that you struggle with. And then it's really important that you look for tense, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So some of the things that I include as well is voice-specific language. So language that really tells me that this is something that someone is telling me. So I fancied a ringing in my ears. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling. I know that this is someone who's telling me this story. And then as this person grows more and more sort of angry and paranoid and nervous, it becomes this repetition. I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I was sitting. And then you have these easy language features of, the repetition of they heard, they suspected, they knew. And you have a metaphor, such a sound, that's a simile, such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. And his hideous heart is obviously alliteration. So easy language features to look for, and any sort of language that stands out to you as really important to this piece. So this is specifically what I looked for. So firstly, I think that we have to talk about tense, and basically what we need to talk about and what we need to note about tense is that present tense means the narrator does not know the ending, and therefore there is a sense of urgency within the writing because they don't know what's going to happen. Whereas when we have past tense, it means the narrator knows what is going to happen in the end, and that's going to influence how the story is told. So if you go back to the piece of writing from Edgar Allan Poe, he says, this I thought and this I think. So we know that this person who is narrating the piece still believes what it is that they are going through actually happened. So they said, this I thought at the time, but I still believe this to this day from the context of which I'm telling you the story. And that's a really important aspect of what Edgar Allan Poe is trying to achieve with this voice, because he's basically saying the narrator is unreliable, not only then, but still now, because the narrator still believes in hindsight of what it is that happened. So that's a really important part of this story. So anything that I sort of, as I said before, that I can easily identify, so alliteration, repetition, metaphor, simile, those easy things are what authors generally tend to use and are easy for your students to find. Give them an arsenal of 5 or 6 language features, and they fare pretty well with that. And then any sort of language that I thought really stood out, and this is where you can talk about the effect of the voice with your students. This is where you can say, hey, what effect did that have on you? Why did these words stand out to you? And what is it that you believe the author is trying to achieve with these words and the effect that they are going to have And this is where you are giving them authority to speak their own mind. They're not just trying to copy what you're saying, which I think is really nice whenever we teach. And then obviously the reliability of the narrator. So once we've looked at tense, once we've looked at language features, and once we've looked at voice-specific language, we can make some conclusions, we can make some deductions about the text, and one of those is obviously the reliability of the narrator. And here the narrator is completely unreliable because he's going mad, and we know that whether we know the text or not, the text has just told us that he's hearing the beating of the heart underneath the planks of wood, when obviously that's not possible. So we know that he is hearing things, whether that's from his conscious or not, that can be debated. But what we know as the reader is that we can't trust him. So we can't trust what he's saying, and we can't trust how he is telling the story. And that's part of the voice that's being created. So a sample response for narrative voice, this is something that I have written. This is not perfect in any way, but I do think that it's really important that we model for our students what we are trying to get them to achieve, because if we can't do it as teachers, then it's unfair for us to expect our students to be able to do it. So this is my response, and I'll read it to you. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe is told from the perspective of an unnamed character who is deranged and unsure of the circumstances he finds himself in, making it an unreliable narrator. Poe uses the first-person narrative point of view to position the reader close to the story and the events being recounted. Their character believes his manner had convinced the officers at the start of the passage, but as he progresses into madness, they suspected, they knew. This use of first-person point of view positions the reader to be privy to the character's thoughts, and we can therefore see how he begins to question his own reality. Poe also uses tense to construct the unreliable voice by reinforcing his delusions of the situation. By switching between tenses, this I thought and this I think, Poe is reinforcing that even upon reflection, the character still believes in the events he is recounting, which means the character cannot be reliable as he is trying to reinforce his perspective of the events, even as the reader begins to question the truth of this recount. This positions the reader, and this is where the students, can come in with their own ideas. This positions the reader to distrust the narrator, as it is clear he is the only character who can hear the beating of the heart. Even though the narrator is convinced the noise was not within my ears, the reader understands that he is the only character who can hear the noise, as the officers heard it not. The construction of the voice as unreliable is therefore reinforced as the reader can deduce that the heart cannot beat if it is buried under the planks. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe therefore constructs an unreliable narrative voice to position the reader to distrust the nature of the events being told. And basically what I've done with this is that I've tried to take away tone. I have tried to remove the idea of tone being the adjective in front of voice, because when we talk about the reliability of the narrator, this is when you can bring in your students' own ideas. If we merely talk about tone, you are only allowing the students to deconstruct this rather than talking about their own ideas and actually bring in critical thinking and bring in their own critical thinking ideas about what it is that the author is trying to achieve. So a different way to teach voice, perhaps a more freeing way to teach voice, particularly narrative voice. And if that's all that you want to take away from this lecture, then that's great. However, I'm going to go into a lot more detail about authorial voice next. And this might be something that's too difficult for your students, and that's okay. But we are going to quickly cover just some few other options to write. And here I have certainly included the tonal words that you can use, so whether it's manic, mad, crazy, unclear, unsure, distrustful, skeptical, or scared, any of those you can certainly talk about, but there's just so much more to voice than just an adjective, and it's about considering the purpose of the voice and then considering how it's constructed. So if you ask yourself, or if you ask your students, how close are you to the narrator? How close are you to the author? What are you privy to? And why are you only privy to this? Or why are you privy to so much? And what does the author actually want you to know? Why does the author not want me to know a particular perspective or a particular character or a particular situation. And then who do you feel for? So who is it that you actually feel sorry for, or feel scared for, or feel excited about? And this is where you can again bring in personal response to voice. So, authorial voice. And I understand that authorial voice has been taken out of the glossary as part of the definition, but authorial voice is something that we discuss all the time, whether we name it authorial voice or not. It is something that we are talking about all the time with our students, and it's actually quite exciting. So here are some academic references to voice. These are all taken from Narrative as Rhetoric, which is from 1996, so between 1961, when Booth first talked about the unreliable and reliable narrator, and 1996. People are still trying to come up with a definitive definition of what voice is. So of course, the glossary which we are using is going to be limited, because even after 30 odd years, people are still trying to consider what voice actually is. So here they say that voice is the fusion of style, tone, and values. It's the presence of the author's voice, but it need not be signaled by any direct statements on his or her part, but through some device in the narrator's language, or indeed through such non-linguistic clues as the structure of the action for conveying a discrepancy in values or judgments between author and narrator. And obviously remember that the narrator is separate to the author, so the narrator may or may not convey the author's values, may or may not convey the author's context. So all of those things open up a whole other idea about how to analyze the text that you are putting in front of your students. Voice exists in the space between style and character. So I quite like this idea about voice, that it exists somewhere between the way that the author has written it and the characters that he has sort of attributed to the voice. So if you're sort of looking at social values and the personality attributed to voice, it sort of moves it towards character rather than style. So if you're looking at the personality of a specific character and the values that that character may or may not possess, then you're moving voice away from the style of the author and more towards the character, which perhaps is more about the voices that are being represented. And if we sort of take all of that, then voice is an element of narrative that is subject to frequent change as a speaker alters tones or expresses different values, or as an author double voices a narrator's or character's speech. And what the double voice means is that the author is basically putting on a voice while also having their own voice. And there's a lot of academic articles around double voicing, but basically it's talking about how the author is using two different voices by wearing two different hats in a way to present their text. So it can use the narrator's voice and then how that narrator is narrating the character's speech. So those are double voices. So this is what the narrator is saying about the character, that those are two voices that are being constructed by the author, and therefore that's a double voice. If that's really confusing to you, don't worry about it. All it's basically saying is that the author is constructing the narrator and the narrator is constructing the character and the way that the character is speaking, and that is purposeful. And then finally, voice is typically part of narrative manner, part of the how of narrative rather than the what. That is, like style, it is typically a mechanism. So it's a construction for influencing its audience's response to and understanding of the characters and events. So the voice is going to tell you, this is how I would like you to respond, but that is up to you. There are just a few more ideas that I want to talk about, and this is particularly because as I started researching more into visual authorial voice and authorial voice within films, I came across some really great ideas around it. And all of these ideas are, particularly from Pharrell, are more about visual. Pharrell is a screenwriter, so she writes plays and films, but she's also done loads of research into authorial voice in screenwriting. So one writer may be distinguishable from another through habits of expression, thinking, knowledge, and preferences. So basically what that means is you can look at different ways that authors write, and that's their authorial voice. It's the way that they express, it's the way they think, it's what they actually know, and it's how they prefer to write something. That's all authorial voice. Another thing that she said is that any picture of the writer created in the mind of the reader is as fictional as the story. And I really like that quote, particularly when it comes to adaptation, because you're basically looking at how someone has adapted a voice or a story into something else. And I think that a really interesting study would be looking at adaptation in terms of how has authorial voice been adapted into a visual medium. So rather than just looking at this is a written story and this is a visual story, think about how that voice has been adapted. And there are loads of different ways that you could do that. So voice points to the fact that we are aware of a pervasive authorial presence, a determinate intelligence and moral sensibility which has invented, ordered, rendered, and expressed all of these literary characters and materials in just this way. And that's from Abrams in 1993, and that's someone that Pharrell certainly refers to a lot. So basically what he's saying is that there is a moral sensibility from all authors, and they are expressing that moral sensibility and that intelligence through these characters and through the way that they have written it and through the construction of their narrative voice, comes their authorial voice as well. And then finally, Pharrell says, the term voice can be understood to refer to the authorial presence of the screenwriters whose consciousness has shaped every aspect of the text. So you're basically looking at how has it been written and what can I deduce from that. So what style has it been written in? What genre? Why have all these things been written in that way? And then authorial voice, this is just from me, is that the authorial voice is the author's voice, and it can be said to be embedded within the text. So I don't know how purposeful authors are in writing their own authorial voice, or if that's just their preferred way of writing. I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that it is constructed through language, style, structure, and genre. And obviously you have perspective and context and all of those other things as part of it as well. So here's a little framework, I guess. This is something that I have adapted from Pharrell that she created. I have changed a couple of little things in it, but not really that much. The things that are written in blue, so story world, images, and sound, are obviously specific to visual text, particularly films. But all the other parts, I just think this is a really great way to look at voice, because basically what Pharrell has said is that you have this craft that you are working within. So whether it's a novel or a short story or whatever form it is that you're writing in, that's going to have specific skills that are required of you, and they are quite formal. So if you're going to write a screenplay for a film, you have to think about the genre that you're writing in, how are you going to structure it, what sort of world are you creating, what characters are you going to create, and the themes that you're going to try and get across. And that's all formal. That's all part of the form that you have chosen to write within. Then comes the more personal. So what language are you going to use? Obviously, if it's a film, you have to think about your images. How is that going to be shot or performed? And then obviously also the soundtrack of all of that. And Quentin Tarantino's made some interesting points about sound. That he was basically told that he needed more non-diegetic sound in his films, and he said, oh, I don't have time to find a composer to do that. And he was basically told, well, find songs that you like and add them into your films to give it more of an idea of who you are. And that's what he's done. So if you listen to the soundtracks of his films, it's full of classics. So that's sort of part of his voice, his directorial style. And then you have tone, content, and mood. And obviously all of the arrows show how they are all intermingled. So language obviously gives you tone, content, and mood. So does images and symbols, and so does sound. And the way that this diagram is structured is that the formal craft comes with a set of expectations that are historical, that the author may choose to subvert or not subvert, but they are part of the craft and they are formal and they have to be part of it. So what you are looking for when you're looking at authorial style is certainly the personality, the ideas, and that's, through all the stuff at the bottom, the language, symbols, tone, content, mood, etc. So those are the things that you can look for when you are identifying authorial style. I did write a response to an idea about authorial voice. I've used the same author, so I've used Edgar Allan Poe, but here I'm referring to much more of his work, because when we're talking about authorial voice, it can be quite difficult just to speak purely about one text. It's definitely easier to do that if it's a novel or if it's just one film. But if you're just looking at one short story, it can be quite difficult to talk about authorial voice, particularly if you don't know the author that well. And admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of the Gothic. I don't know heaps about the Gothic. I'm much more of a science fiction person, or even just a normal fiction. So all these sort of very stylized genres, I don't know a whole lot about them, but I did a bunch of research to understand the Gothic genre more, but also understand what Poe is trying to do with the genre. And if you are going to do an authorial voice study, then choose something that is really stylized for your students. Make it super obvious. So rather than choosing just a realistic fiction text and then get them to talk about genre, choose something that is really a genre study, whether it's sci-fi, spec fic, fantasy, Gothic, horror, whatever. Give them certain tropes that they have to work within, and then identify those within the text as part of their authorial voice. So I'll read this response to you. I'm not going to lie, it took me a very long time to write this because I really needed to understand Poe. I really needed to understand his context, but also the context of the genre and the context of the genre at the moment that he was writing in. So just keep all of that in mind. Authorial voice is complex, and to fully understand this concept, we must take into consideration the intertextual and contextual influences of the author. Edgar Allan Poe is known as the inventor of the modern detective story, as well as his tales about terror and the unknown. When analysing Poe, the Gothic genre needs to be considered as well, as most of Poe's writing operates within the tropes of this genre. In the short story The Telltale Heart, the narrator is constructed as unreliable through the structure of the story and the first-person point of view. This is part of the Gothic genre, as it plays on the trope of the dispossessed voice, an important generic convention in Gothic literature. While it can be argued that the unnamed character does not lack physical possessions, for his gold I had no desire, the character is certainly dispossessed of sanity. This is where Poe's voice comes through in the text, as he constructs a character which leaves the reader questioning the reliability of being able to tell the story correctly. His construction of the narrator who is dispossessed of sanity therefore becomes a dispossessed voice within the story. The construction of this narrator becomes Poe's way of writing about the voices in our society that are often silenced, such as the mentally ill. Specifically within The Telltale Heart, Poe uses dashes to construct the the disrupted thoughts of the narrator, particularly towards the end of the passage as the narrator becomes more frantic and dispossessed of mind. Almighty God, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew, they were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought and this I think. Poe's authorial voice is coming through here as his writing style becomes evident with a repetition of they, representing the otherness apparent in the Gothic genre. The narrator is seeing the police officers as separate to himself, and he becomes the other in the text through this use of disrupted thoughts. This is Poe's way of examining that liminal space between reality and madness, a common feature in his writing and the Gothic genre. Another example of Poe's authorial voice can be found in his poem The Raven, where again Poe examines the liminal space between reality and madness. His use of rhyme and rhythm in the poem, as well as many other poetic techniques, constructs his authorial voice within the Gothic genre. The poem, written in trochaic heptameter, uses the repetition of nevermore and nothing more to construct an unreliable narrator as he is drifting in the liminal space between reality and madness. This is Poe's authorial voice coming through in his choices of first-person narration, as well as his examination of aspects of reality. By working within these tropes of Gothic literature, Poe's authorial voice can be heard through his commenting on the dispossessed voices within society. So I don't think that there's much more to say about this idea of authorial voice with Poe. So I am going to move on to A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Much of the authorial voice certainly comes through in the research that Towles did. It is impossible to remove authorial voice from the character voices or the narrative voice. I don't think that you can say this is authorial voice and this is narrative voice and really separate those two. And I don't think that Towles attempts to do this. His authorial voice is certainly playful, but it's also ironic, whereas the Count's voice, and the Count is the main character in the story, is just playful. He doesn't have a sense of irony as much as the authorial voice does. Towles is very much in the story because he is much more concerned about the future of Russia, particularly when he's writing about the past, whereas the Count is not as concerned, and that's because the Count obviously doesn't have Towles' knowledge of the future of Russia. So this was set in sort of around the part that I will be reading is set sort of around the 1920s in Moscow, and Towles obviously has done a lot of research around this, and that comes through. That's part of his authorial voice. So I'll read this to you, and I'm not saying that this is authorial voice and this is narrative voice. I'm saying this is an example of each. There is definitely also authorial voice in the narrative voice, and there's narrative voice in the authorial voice. They are not separate, but I will read to you this part, and I hope that you can sort of see what I'm trying to get at. From those great rooms overlooking the Fontanka Canal, new cuisines, fashions, and ideas all took their first tentative steps into Russian society. But if this was so, it was largely due to the hive of activity beneath the parlour floors, for there, just a few steps below street level, were the butlers, cooks, and footmen, who together ensured that when the notions of Darwin or Manet were first bandied about, all went off without a hitch. So this comes through in Towles' research. He's researched all of this, and then he has given that personality. He has certainly personified a lot of it. Obviously, cuisines, fashion, and ideas can't take tentative steps. So that's part of his authorial voice. Again, easy language features. Narrative voice. Yes, some claimed that Emil Zhukovsky was a curmudgeon, and others called him abrupt. Some said he was a short man with a shorter temper, but none could dispute his genius. Just consider the dish the Count was finishing at that very moment, a saltimbocca, I'm not sure how to say that, fashioned from necessity. So here you certainly have a narrative, someone who's narrating what is happening to the Count. Just consider the dish the Count was finishing at that very moment. That is the narrator telling you this is what's happening. And here I've just included a quote from Phelan, and if you think about this is written in 2015, so 16 years ago, and people are still trying to come to terms with what voice is. So it's no wonder that we are grappling with this concept. So Phelan argues that texts represent a streamlined version of the real author, an actual or purported subset of the real author's capacities, traits, attitudes, beliefs, values, and other properties that play an active role in the construction of the particular text. And the reason that I have included this is because it's giving you a few more ideas of things that you can look for in a text when you are analysing that with your students. And then I'll give you just one more example. The author in A Gentleman in Moscow, so obviously Amor Towles, he changes the point of view to point out the naivete of the main character. So the Count is quite naive about what it is, particularly in the beginning of the text, about what is happening in Russia. So I just want to give you an example of that. So here, authorial voice, and the waiters, like those of a Parisian cafe. The Piazza's waiters could best be complimented as efficient. Accustomed to navigating crowds, they could easily seat your party of 8 at a table for 4. Having noted your preferences over the sound of the orchestra, within minutes they would return with the various drinks balanced on a tray and dispense them around the table in rapid succession without misplacing a glass. If, with your menu in hand, you hesitated for even a second to place your order, they would lean over your shoulder and poke at a specialty of the house. And when the last morsel of dessert had been savoured, they would whisk away your plate, present your cheque, and make your change in under a minute. In other words, the waiters of the Piazza knew their trade to the crumb, the spoon, and the kopeck. So you certainly have authorial voice here because you've got all of this contextual information that's being given to you. You can also say that this is the narrative voice, that the narrator is giving you this. And it's hard to differentiate the two. And then here is a very clear example of narrative voice. So in the preceding minutes, there must have been such a rush of parties arriving for dinner that the winter air had yet to dissipate from the fabric of their coats. Here was the greatcoat of a soldier with a dusting of snow on its shoulders. Here the woolen jacket of a bureaucrat still damp. And here was a black mink coat with a collar of ermine, or was it sable, that was in all probability worn by the mistress of a commissar. So very clearly, narrative voice here. You have a narrator that's telling you all of the different types of coats that are there. And then you have this interjection of a question, or was it sable? And that is the narrator giving you a few thoughts from the Count. So the Count has gone into the wardrobe and is basically looking and sniffing these coats because he misses the outside. So of ermine, or was it sable, is sort of an interjection of the Count's thoughts in the narrative voice. So I'm going to talk about voice in film. There are different ways that you can label this. You can say that it's dramatic voice, you can say it's authorial voice, you can say it's directorial voice. I don't believe, and again, I am not an authority on this, I don't believe there's a right or wrong in terms of that. I'm sure that other people have different opinions, but I will just discuss voice as in voice in film. I thought about calling it dramatic voice, but I think that's too limiting for what it is that I want to talk about. Here are a couple of different working definitions of voice, and I've said working definitions on purpose because, like I've mentioned numerous times now, it's really hard to pin down a specific definition. So here are a few ideas. So it can be understood to refer to the authorial presence of the writer, and I think I've sort of covered that a bit now. So de Siga and Rush in 2002, they claim that mainstream American films seek to erase the evidence of a storyteller. And they basically talk a lot about the structure to order events, and they name this sort of the dramatic voice. There is a whole bunch of academic research out there that talks about structure as the authorial voice within film. There are some very interesting examples of this. If you want to do a directorial study about structure, someone who would be really interesting to do could be Scorsese. Particularly some of his early student work looked very much at how structure was his voice, and was his voice his way of commenting on what was sort of happening with the Vietnam War. So that could be a really interesting way of doing it. He has a short film that he did at film school called The Great Shave. There's a lot of blood in it, so don't just go blindly showing it to students without viewing it first yourself. But that could be an interesting way to look at his voice and how that's actually started to impact the way that he directs now and writes now. So anyway, a little aside. Again, this is from Farrell, that's 2017. We still don't have a clear definition of voice, but she said that clearly much of what we're calling voice in film is under the control of the director. And that's really important, I think, because we tell our students when you talk about any film, you mention the director, and I think that we should keep doing that. I don't think that we should suddenly bombard them with the names of the cinematographers and the editors and the sound design and the costume designers and the script writers, and it's just too much. So the director is the one who is in charge of putting all of that together, so just leave it as the voice in the film is under the control of the director. So for example, things like the relative realism of color scheme, I'll talk more about that in a minute, the lighting contrast ratios, the set design, the casting, the balance of the ambient sounds dialogue, and the final editing pattern are beyond the realm of the writer. So she's basically saying the screenwriter has written a script, but the end product is beyond the screenwriter, and therefore you're looking at the director's voice within the film. And by disengaging the argument for voice from questions of quality, any voice is open to interrogation and description based on its stylistic continuities. So what Farrell is basically saying here is look at style continuity, and you will find voice. So look for the directorial style and you will find directorial voice, or the voice within the film, or the authorial voice, whatever you want to call it. And it's open to interrogation, it's open to comment, it is open to deconstruction. And I think that this is particularly useful for literature, because so often in literature we talk about national identity and belonging and aesthetics, and what Farrell says here is that voice codifies personal characteristics and aesthetics, and can also codify characteristics of national belonging. So it's basically saying that there are particular codes or conventions within the text that the voice is being used to talk about or represent. And one example of that is if you look, for example, at a classic American Western that has been written by an Australian, there are perhaps certain choices of language that are not going to work because they don't have the right voice. They're not using the right language to depict that. So let's move on to voice in film. So basically what you're looking for is the interconnectedness of style, structure, script, acting, editing, set, and costume design, and that's a lot. So when you've looked at all of these things, you are looking at a voice in a film. And I'm not talking about how a voice is, so a group of people who are represented as a voice within a film. What I'm talking about is this idea of an authorial voice within the film, so the director's voice in the film. A couple of different ways that are good sort of ins is obviously voiceover, because the voiceover is the narrative voice within a film. So you're looking at how is that voice shaping your response, and a really easy one to do that with is obviously Michael Moore, because he is not only the narrative voice and narrates the whole documentary, but he's also a character in it, and he uses his character voice to also position the audience to elicit a particular response. So that's a really easy way to get students to think about voice if you are looking at it from that point of view. Perhaps if you have a lower ability class, you might want to look at it as a good entry point of a really clear narrative voice within a documentary. Some things that you might want to think about when you are talking about this for students. So character, voice, and perspective. What's the difference? Is there a difference? Are they the same thing? Certainly the perspective is going to influence the voice, and I mean that like how it is coming across, the way that it sounds, but also the context of that perspective is going to influence the voice in terms of how it's represented, but also how it is spoken. Voiceover guides the film, and that's really employed as the narrative voice, particularly in documentaries. There are also some feature films, particularly in later years, that use narrative voice or use this voiceover to guide the film. I'll give you an example of it in a minute. But that's a really easy way to talk to your students about narrative voice. Now, what's the difference between a director and an auteur? It's just something to think about. So an auteur is someone who has created such a distinct style that they have moved from director to an auteur. And I will discuss one of those in a minute because it's a really great way to actually look at authorial voice. And then look at the dramatic, the authorial, the directorial voice, whatever it is that you want to call it, is certainly easiest to identify through directorial style. So making the distinction between dramatic voice, the structure of the film, for some, and narrative voice, the direction or interpretation, allows us to talk about the shifting location of meaning from stories whose apparent center is in the working out of events themselves to stories whose focus is on the tension between events and their telling. And I'm not going to talk too much about that quote. It's from Farrell, which I have clearly forgotten to put in there. But I think that it's something for you to consider. So you're looking at structure, you're also looking at interpretation. If we looked at authorial voice for Edgar Allan Poe in terms of genre, then why not do the same for voice in film? So a voice in a film is certainly going to change depending on the genre of the film. So you're not going to have a horror voice or someone who directs horrors suddenly go in and direct romantic comedies as well, or perhaps you will. I know that there are some people out there who will have a name for someone who's done that, but in broad strokes, genre is going to impact the way that the film is represented, absolutely. And that's because that a genre film has to conform to specific generic conventions, and therefore the director's voice has to work within these restraints. Even if it's subverting them, there has to be some conformity to generic conventions so that people understand that this is a film within a specific genre. Some examples that are really easy for your students to understand are obviously horror, Western, fantasy, sci-fi, gothic, you can go on and on and on, but give them really clear grounding. This is a traditional Western. This is the voice of the director of that Western, and then look at subversion. And obviously once a director understands this genre, then they can manipulate it. So if you're going to look at Western, look at a really old classic Western and then look at someone who's subverting it, whether you're looking at Tarantino or whether you're looking at, what's the one that so many people always do, Clint Eastwood, any of those, right? So you have to give them a good grounding, then say this is now how it's been adapted or this is how it's changed. The genre of the film is going to influence all the aspects of the film. That includes the set design, the storyline, the costumes, the structure, and then it's the director that is going to put their spin on this, and that's the way that you can look at voice. So how has the director worked within the constraints of this genre? I already sort of talked about this, but cultural iconography and myths in a Western, such as a sheriff and cowboy, these are cultural iconographies. And they belong within the Western genre. Once these are understood by the audience, so once you understand what the purpose of a sheriff is, what the purpose of a cowboy is, then you can be subverted. And this is part of the voice of the film. So, for example, if you're looking at a sheriff and a cowboy, and then you look at Westworld, suddenly these roles are changing. And that's part of the purpose of the text, and it's part of how it is subverting the genre, and it's part of the voice of the film. So it's also, if you're looking at a classic Western, it's part of the cultural identity of this film. So we understand that there are cowboys, there might be a sheriff, there might be a damsel in distress, and then that becomes part of this cultural identity. For example, if you have a classic American Western film, but they're speaking with Australian accents, that's not going to fit in with the cultural identity of the film, also because the language is going to be different. So that's just something to consider. And understanding the context of the director is definitely going to help you to understand the voice of the film, because as we understood the context of Edgar Allan Poe and his obsessions or interests within the Gothic, but also within sort of the liminal spaces of reality and insanity, we understand what he is trying to achieve. And it is similar with the director. If you understand their context, their interests, you're going to understand how they have approached a particular film. So here are a couple of Wes Anderson trailers.
Welcome to the fantastic world of Mr. Fox. Woo! Dance. His life is fantastic. Pure wild animal craze. His wife is fantastic. If what I think is happening, it better not be. His neighbors, not so fantastic. This is Bogus, Bunce, and Bean, three of the meanest, nastiest, ugliest farmers in his family. What was that? They're digging us out. But they're about to discover. Oh, Foxy, is help on the way? He's one fox. I've got an idea. You can't out-fox. Oh, what do you got? I can see in the dark. We can use that. Rabbit. I'm fast. Badger. Demolitions expert. What? Since when? Here, put these bandit hats on. I don't have a bandit hat, but I modified this tube sock. They look good. Yeah. The only security is if honey beagles laced some blueberries with sleeping powder. Beagles love blueberries. A titanium card. What's this thing you do? The whistle with the clicking sound. That's my trademark. We're different. We all are. Him especially. But there's something kind of fantastic about that, isn't there? I can fight my own fight. I guess we should start doing something, right? Let's see some hustle. Yeah! Woo. This fall, forget Super. That was close, Red. Be careful. Oh, careful. Ignore incredible. Yarn a lot. Because I'm little. It's all about fantastic. You really are fantastic. I try. Fantastic Mr. Fox. Just lightning bolt. This fence might be electric. Well, I just hope it doesn't mean thunder, because I have a phobia of that.
The Japanese archipelago, 20 years in the future. Canine saturation has reached epidemic proportions. An outbreak of dog flu rips through the city of Megasaki. Mayor Kobayashi issues emergency orders, calling for a hasty quarantine. Trash Island becomes an exile colony.
The Isle of Dogs.
I don't think I can stomach any more of this garbage.
Exactly. Same here. Words out of my mouth. Nobody's giving up around here, and don't you forget it, ever. You're Rex. You're king. You're duke. You're boss. I'm chief. We're a pack of scary, indestructible alpha dogs.
Atari Kobayashi, you heroically hijacked a Junior Turboprop XJ750 and flew it to the island because of your dog. Darn it. I've got a crush on you.
We get the idea. You were looking for your lost dog Spots. Does anybody know him?
Spots, if he's alive, may very well be living, even at this moment, as a captive prisoner.
Somebody is up to something. Will you help him? The little pilot.
Why should I?
Because he's a 12-year-old boy. Dogs love those.
We'll find him. Wherever he is, if he's alive, we'll find your dog.
It's gonna be a fight.
Or somebody spoke his language.
The north, a long rickety causeway over a noxious sludge marsh leading to a radioactive landfill polluted by toxic chemical garbage. That's our destination.
Great.
Get ready to jump.
We just got cut off there. I'm not really sure what happened. Apologies. Please go and watch the trailer for Moonrise Kingdom on YouTube. I can't seem to get it to work. The other ones seem to work. But anyway, let's talk about Wes Anderson's directing style. So, obviously, the production and editing are very distinct in his films. But that's not all that makes his voice distinct. So these are a couple of the other things. So a lot of the action's actually choreographed. And in his latest, The French Dispatch, he actually choreographed the acting to the point where he choreographed the blinking of the characters because he wanted it to be part of a particular beat that he was trying to create in the film. So that's certainly part of his style. So also in the French Dispatch, there are actors that are posing while movement is happening around them. And obviously that's to represent different perspectives. You can talk about how certain characters are part of the story and certain characters are not part of the story. Or perhaps it's to represent what is important to the perspectives that we are privy to. But that's just one of the things that you can talk about. I already mentioned that a lot of the action is happening to a beat, but also the color is used to symbolize the time and the mood. So many directors do this where when they do an ellipsis, so a flashback, they change to black and white. Or if it's a flash forward, they might change it to black and white as well. Like in something like Better Call Saul, they generally start each episode black and white, and that's to show where he is now. And then it goes back into color because that's the main story. In Wes Anderson, he uses it much more to actually represent sort of the time in which the film is set. So Moonrise Kingdom uses a lot of browns and yellows and greens to sort of represent the 70s. And if you look at something like The Life Aquatic, also by Wes Anderson, there's loads of blue because it's all about the ocean. And if you're looking at something like the Grand Budapest Hotel, it's a lot of pinks and oranges and reds. So he uses all these colors and creates very distinct color palettes. So I think that a study into these color palettes and what they represent would be really interesting, and how they represent mood. I think that it would be a really nice way for students to understand how mood is represented visually. because it's so deliberate. And why not give students an easy text for them to do something that's really obvious? Another thing that Anderson does is that he changes the aspect ratios to represent time periods. So he might go from I can't remember what the aspects are, but like a classic cinema sort of longer aspect would be current time, and then it would go into more of a square, which represents the past. And you can talk about whether that's to represent the changing television sets that we have. It doesn't really matter. What it matters is that it's a representation of a time period. And one more thing that he uses a lot is so Heinrich Wölfflin was an art historian, and he came up with this idea of planimetric composition. So planimetric composition is something that Anderson does a lot. It's not something that he's the only one that he does, but his movies are very accessible to students, except perhaps for the Royal Tenenbaums. It has quite a graphic suicide scene in it, so just be mindful of that if you're going to study him. But just another side note on the Royal Tenenbaums, it would be fabulous to look at costumes and set design for that if you were going to look at it. That was an aside. Okay, so let's look at planimetric composition. So I've included two images on the left. They are both from Moonrise Kingdom. So the top is actually the narrator, and I spoke about how a voiceover can be the narrative voice. This is the narrator of Moonrise Kingdom. As you can see, his costume completely stands out. He is wearing a red coat, and he wears this throughout, in a film that is mainly yellow, brown, and green, and you can see that in the background. So let's talk about this planimetric composition. So it's where the background looks flat, and if you look at these two images, it could look like they are standing on a set, and I know that they are standing on a set, but it could look like they're standing on a stage. So it looks really flat compared to the character who is in the middle of the shot. It's a rectangular geometry. If you go and Google these images, you can see that these images have been cropped. They're actually much longer. So you can see that they are very much in the middle, whereas here it looks like it's almost a square, but they are very much in the middle of a longer image. It provides frontal presentation of the action, and what that basically means is that we are given the action direct on in the most focal point that it can be. As opposed to other films or even still shots, the background is not blurred. So if some directors might want to choose to focus particularly on the actor or their face or their action, they will blur the background, but this does not blur the background because the background is the stage. So it's really important that that background is flat. And what it does in terms of voice is that it brings focus to the shot, to the character, and that's going to give voice to that character. So often you will see that character and then it will move to them speaking, or it will move to them being in that it's their perspective that we are seeing this from. So it's important that we have that when we're talking about voice. And it also gives the audience a visual clue. So here's a visual clue of the perspective that you are going to be encountering. And then particularly in Anderson's film, it's also very much deadpan comedic use of this framing of the composition. So when we talk about Anderson's directorial style, we're talking about the planimetric composition, and that's part of his voice. So this is where you are deconstructing that director voice. The films are shrouded in authorial framing, and what that basically means is that when you have authorial framing, you have a story within a story. So here is an author telling you the story. If you look at the Royal Tenenbaums, it is a book that is borrowed from a library. If you look at The Life Aquatic, it's a film within a film. I actually think that I've written all these in here. So he draws the audience in and he's creating these worlds, and they're very much constructions. And we are invited to look at these worlds, but these worlds certainly also look back at us and they reflect us. They reflect particular people, and it's very stylized, but they are representations of particular voices within our society. And these characters, and this is very much part of his style, is that they move in parallel lines, and that makes the film look like a play. So if you look at any of his films, particularly if you look at something like the Grand Budapest Hotel, when you look at Anderson, particularly look at some of his later work, because he's become more and more stylized, but many of these films that he does, the characters are moving in parallel lines. So it looks like they're moving on a stage. It looks like they're moving as part of a play. He also uses compass point editing, and this is an actual style. So this is a really easy one that you can talk to your students about. And it's where the character is only moving in 4 directions, so north, east, south, and west. And the camera is always panning in 90-degree increments or 180-degree increments if the characters are talking. And it's almost like that is actually imitating a book. So he said, she said, sort of, but with a camera. So he said, then she said. And that's a really interesting way that he's sort of, that's part of his voice. And I think that Anderson really wants the audience to know that they're watching a film. And he does this, he's obviously breaking the fourth wall a lot, but he also does it by sort of having shaking camera movement. So he'll go from this very stylized compass point editing where he's moving 90 degrees, moving 90 degrees, moving 180 degrees, and then he'll go into sort of shaky camera movement where suddenly you're going, oh, now we're running with the character, and it's like this shaky camera movement. And I've just included in there that it's sort of similar to Dogma style films, which is what Lars von Trier does, but it's definitely to a less extent. Lars von Trier is almost like a documentary style films. I would not recommend whatsoever studying Lars von Trier with your students. Very inappropriate. But it is a particular style with this sort of shaky camera movement. And that's part of Anderson's style. He chooses that deliberately to go from the compass point editing to this shaky camera movement. He also has this very clear authorial presence. So we know when we go and see a Wes Anderson film what to expect. Same when we go see a Quentin Tarantino film or when we go see a Taika Waititi film. There are particular styles that we expect, whether it's from the story, whether it's from the visual, the comedy. There are these this authorial presence that's in the film. So in the words of Anderson himself, this is what he's had to say. I certainly don't feel like a part of any establishment because I do feel like I kind of have my own style and voice. So he is very much aware that he has his own style and he has his own voice and he has his own authorial voice. So if he is aware of that, that means that it's very much there, and that means we can deconstruct it with our students. When you're making a movie, you want to feel like you can take it in any direction. You can experiment as long as it is, in the end, feels like this is what it's meant to be. And it has some authority. So again, he's talking about having authority within the film, and he's talking about experimenting within his films. And again, that means that it's open for deconstruction and comment. I have a way of filming things and staging them and designing sets, and we know that from just looking at his trailers. There were times when I thought I should change my approach, but in fact, this is what I like to do. It's sort of like my handwriting as a movie director. It is his authorial voice. So he's basically said it himself. I have a particular style. That means that we can say he has a particular voice. So I'm just going to briefly talk about film structure as voice in film. So Wes Anderson shows analepsis in his films through aspect ratio changes, and this is a narrative device that visually shows time structure. So you're basically looking at aspect ratios as a way to show time structure. So if you're going to do a comparison between narrative devices, this is something you could talk about. And this is what I talk about when I talk about the authorial framing within his text. So Mount Rushmore starts with these open curtains that are opening, very much similar to Baz Luhrmann with his trilogy of that velvet curtains. The Royal Tenenbaums start with a book being borrowed from a library. The Grand Budapest Hotel starts with a girl who has read the book of the story that's being told. So again, you have that authorial framing that's happening. and The Life Aquatic starts with a film within a film. The Darjeeling Limited is being written by the character as we view it, so the character is actually writing the story as we experience it. Moonrise Kingdom has a narrator, and that's the narrator who was in the red jacket, and he speaks directly to the camera and is very much breaking that fourth wall. And a lot of this is very meta, you know, having a character write what is being written is very meta. And these films are very much telling the audience, I am a story, and stories have storytellers, and therefore you can analyze it. And in this case, you're analyzing Wes Anderson. So once you've obviously understood voice, directorial voice, then have a look at parody, have a look at pastiche. Give your students good grounding, firm grounding in the classic, in what it is you want them to understand, and then look at parody, then look at how people are doing it differently. I'm going to hopefully this plays.
One's carrying a falcon, they're twins in matching tracksuits. Hey, look at that. Why, that's Danny Glover.
Hello. A tale of handmade horror.
Hey, they've sent us some kind of communique.
Dear homeowner, can we kill you? The murderers.
Dear murderers, no, you may not. The homeowner.
The story of one determined father.
Hey, kids, come on, let's go to the panic room.
And his two precocious children.
We have to protect ourselves, or we'll die.
Quick, let's gather all our weapons. Rock hammer, Swiss Army knife, slingshot, firecracker, ship in a bottle, protractor, picture Vitas Piaf, assault rifle, little flag.
Darn.
We should have left sooner.
With Tilda Swinton as the town constable.
Hey, wow, we're saved.
Who here are the murderers? I see.
The New York Times calls it You Had Me at Wes Anderson. And Fangoria magazine says Defa. Owen Wilson, Gwyneth Paltrow, Angelica Houston, Jason Schwartzman, Adrian Brody, Stop Motion Mouse, and Alec Baldwin as the narrator. The Midnight Coterie of Sinister Intruders.
Rated G.
There are also other directors that you could study. I'm not sure if you would do Quentin Tarantino in the classroom. He might be too violent, but he's actually a really great director to do because he's also the writer. Same with Wes Anderson. So, you know, writes and directs his own movies. So there's really authorial voice that's present there. If you were to do Quentin Tarantino, I mean, I would do a genre study because of the way that he subverts so many genres, but also really stays true to them and pays homage to a lot of genres. And I think that what he had to say about a filmography is not a hit or miss thing. You have a vision, you have a voice, and each new film is your new conversation. So he's really clear about this. He knows that he has an authorial voice and he has a particular vision that he wants to bring to the screen. So why not, you know, talk to the students about that if you had the right class and if you had parental permission. Someone else that you could do is Stanley Kubrick. I don't know if you would do that in your classroom. I'm just giving you some options here. I think that he would be really interesting to do, but definitely with the right class and the right sort of frame of mind for yourself and for your students. I mean, all of these you could do. Ridley Scott, Christopher Nolan, Steven Spielberg. I know that lots of actors talk about Steven Spielberg's style and how visionary it is. So that would be someone who might be really easy for your students. If I was to do someone like Baz Luhrmann, I would definitely be looking at an adaptation study, how he adapts these classic stories, you know, Romeo and Juliet, I guess, is the classic, but also, you know, Moulin Rouge, and you can talk about the cultural iconography within that, but then how he's adapted that. I mean, he's an Australian, he has adapted this very Parisian French icon, and the way that he did that. And I sort of mentioned it before, but if you were going to do Martin Scorsese, you know, definitely look at a genre study. And you could look at some of his early work and then compare that to some of his older work. Someone else that you could do would be Taika Waititi. He might be really good for a lower school study. But I mean, doing 2 or 3 films would give you some really great material to look at the way that that authorial voice is shaped and the way that the style is really impacting that. That's all that I have. So thank you so much for listening. These are my references. If any of these sort of grab your attention, I would recommend looking at Wayne Booth in The Rhetoric of Fiction. I would definitely recommend looking at Farrell. I think that she's great, and I also think that it would be really great to look at, excuse me, there's so many really good YouTube videos out there that just give you really quick snapshots of different directors and how their style has sort of come about. So that's a really easy way for you to digest the information if you are like me and prefer to sort of get your information visually. But that's all that I have. If you want to get in contact with me, please do so. If you have any questions, if you want to have a conversation about voice, please get in contact with me. You can do that on the ETA website. I'm the PD officer there. My name is Josie Wang. And thank you so much for listening. It's a long lecture, I know, but I hope that you got something out of it. So thank you.